For a brief moment after the war, when the smoke of Europe's slaughter had barely cleared, an idea of revenge took shape among some Holocaust survivors that was as terrible and as simple as the suffering that inspired it. They were not a movie team of superheroes. They were human beings who had endured the unimaginable, and they formed groups to hunt perpetrators and to settle a debt that the courts and nations seemed unable to pay. Among these groups, the most notorious was a secret cell called Nakam, a Hebrew word meaning revenge. Nakam grew from the ash of the Vilna ghetto and the partisan resistance. Its members were veterans of Jewish underground movements, people who had lost family, who had seen children taken away and gas chambers operate, and who believed that ordinary justice would never match the scale of the crime they had endured. At the center of Nakam's story stands Abba Kovner, a poet, partisan leader, and a voice of outrage in the Jewish underground. Kovner and his compatriots initially focused on finding and killing individual Nazi war criminals when possible, a grim business of tracking, abducting, and executing those responsible for atrocities. But within their ranks, a more sweeping ambition took hold. If 6 million Jews had been slaughtered, could a reprisal of comparable scale be imagined? Even if only as a symbolic act of proportional vengeance, how far could a retribution lawfully or morally be taken? How do you measure justice against industrialized murder? These questions were not theoretical for people who lived through the Holocaust. They were visceral and immediate. Two plans are most often described in the historical record and in memoirs linked to Nakam. The first, and most shocking on its face, was an attempt to poison water supplies in German cities. Kovner reputedly sought to secure quantities of poison and have it released into municipal systems, with the goal of causing mass fatalities among the German civilian population. That plan, later called Plan A, either failed or was abandoned when Kovner was detained while trying to return to Europe with poison, and accounts say that the lethal chemicals were thrown overboard when he was arrested. The ethical and practical complexity of such a plot haunts historians and commentators because it would have targeted civilians in an act indistinguishable from the crimes the Nazis had committed. Scholars debate whether the water poisoning plan was ever truly operational or largely aspirational, but its presence in memoirs and investigations shows the scale of anger and the collapse of moral boundaries that some survivors felt after the war. When mass attacks on cities proved impractical, Nakam turned to a more limited and surgically targeted plan, an operation often described as the poisoning of loaves of bread destined for German prisoners of war being held by the Allies. In April of 1946, a small Nakam cell infiltrated a bakery that supplied bread to the Langwasser internment camp near Nuremberg, which held German prisoners and members of SS units. The weapon of choice was arsenic, and the method was simple and low-tech. The conspirators brushed arsenic onto thousands of loaves over the course of a night. Contemporary press reports and subsequent investigations describe 3 members of Nakam spending hours coating loaves with poison and then fleeing when circumstance threatened detection. The scale of that operation and the number of people affected has been the subject of extensive inquiry and heated debate. What happened next is contested in the sources, and the disagreement is morally and historically important. Some contemporary and later accounts reported that more than 2,000 German prisoners became ill after eating the bread, and that a few hundred required hospitalization. Various newspaper stories from the spring of 1946 reported illness among the prisoners and speculated about intentional poisoning, while Allied military investigators did search the bakery and interrogate suspects. Several historians, working from declassified files, memoirs, and interviews, have concluded that while many prisoners fell sick, there is no reliable evidence that the campaign produced mass fatalities. Other scholars, and some popular retellings, repeat larger casualty figures, and sometimes assert that thousands were poisoned fatally. The prudent historical judgment reflected in detailed archival work is that the bakery poisoning caused widespread illness and hospitalizations, but no confirmed mass deaths, and that the exact number of the sick remains disputed. Seeking to understand why the poisoning did not produce the catastrophic toll Nakam intended, investigators pointed to several factors. The arsenic doses may have been too low or unevenly applied to the loaves, the bread may have been distributed across populations, or the specific form of arsenic and method of application might have reduced lethality. Some narratives suggest that American military authorities moved quickly to treat and isolate the ill, limiting fatalities. Others point to confusion and uncertainty among witnesses, and the tendency of later retellings to conflate numbers or to give dramatic emphasis to a story that also served as a moral parable about revenge. Whatever the explanation, the outcome was that Nakam's most audacious operation did not produce the kind of exterminatory response its planners had imagined, and this failure had both tactical and psychological consequences for the group. Nakam did not stop at mass plots. Parallel to attempts at mass poisoning, smaller teams pursued targeted assassinations of known or suspected war criminals who had escaped justice. These operations were furtive and uneven, sometimes successful and sometimes fatally compromised. The moral calculus here is knotty. On one level, Nakam's targeted acts resembled extrajudicial vengeance in other post-conflict settings, where survivors or partisan veterans feel compelled to deliver immediate justice when legal systems appear slow, weak, or indifferent. On another level, these killings were acts of lawlessness that raised painful questions about who has the right to execute judgment and whether such acts perpetuate cycles of violence. Some members of the Jewish leadership in Palestine and the emerging Israeli state disavowed Nakam's worst excesses, even as many veterans of the Yishuv and the Jewish Brigade quietly sympathized with the understandable motives driving revenge. The reactions of Allied authorities to Nakam's operations show the uneasy political context of the immediate post-war years. The Allied occupation forces were trying to restore civil order in Germany, to process prisoners, and to rebuild shattered institutions, while also responding to pressure for prosecutions of war criminals. The discovery that former victims planned mass reprisals against German civilians, or that they had poisoned prison rations, complicated Allied priorities. Military police investigated the Langwasser poisonings, arrested suspects, and held inquiries. But the conjunction of legal complexity, political sensitivity, and the chaotic post-war environment meant that many probes did not result in long prosecutions. Over time, the simmering story of Nakam was folded into broader debates about memory, justice, and whether the moral stain of Nazi crimes had any legitimate analog in revenge. To tell this story only as a catalogue of plots is to miss how Nakam emerged from a broken moral universe. Holocaust survivors lived in a world where relatives had been murdered, where police and courts had often been co-opted by killers, and where the scale of the crime against them dwarfed ordinary responses. For many survivors, the notion that legal justice would ever match the crime seemed absurd, and this existential despair produced a hunger for a different kind of accountability. Kovner himself was not merely a crusher of limbs in anger. He was a thinker and poet who tried to give language to irredeemable loss. Nakam's rhetoric, furious, apocalyptic, sometimes explicitly proportional in its logic, expressed the rawest human calculations about retribution. To understand Nakam historically is to understand the texture of post-war trauma and the volatile mixture of despair, rage, and political opportunity that shaped decisions in 1945 and 1946. The historiography of Nakam has shifted over the decades. Early reports and some sensationalist retellings emphasized lurid numbers and the dramatic image of a plan to kill 6 million Germans. The phrase "a nation for a nation" captured headlines and provoked moral outrage. Later, more sober archival research by historians like Dina Porat and others has nuanced the narrative, showing a complex web of plans, partial successes, failures, and moral debates. Porat and researchers who have re-examined British and American occupation records, Israeli archival material, and memoirs place the bakery poisoning within a larger matrix of underground justice and trace its operational details, while also cautioning against uncritical repetition of exaggerated casualty figures. The most responsible modern accounts treat Nakam as a mix of vengeful impracticality and targeted strike capability, and they stress the contested nature of the evidence about human tolls. What did Nakam mean for post-war memory and for subsequent generations? This is an unsettled question. In the 1950s and 1960s, many in Israel and among Jewish communities abroad preferred a narrative of heroism and institution building rather than explicit public sympathy for extra-legal vengeance. Over time, Nakam acquired a place in cultural memory as a provocative and uncomfortable footnote, sometimes condemned, sometimes romanticized, and sometimes used as a rhetorical device to ask how victims respond to the absence of proportional justice. Where memorials speak of victims and courts bring perpetrators to trial, Nakam reminds us of the human cost when systems of justice break down and private actors try to fill the void. It is also a story about the limits of revenge, the bakery operation, the failed water poisoning, and the moral qualms of contemporary leaders show how even the most anguished plans can be thwarted by practical realities and by the very ethical questions they raise. Finally, the Nakam story forces modern audiences to consider an enduring paradox about atrocity and response. The impulse to take revenge is natural and widely documented across human societies, but turning that impulse into state policy or moral approval risks reproducing the violence one decries. Some of Nakam's members later integrated into Israeli society. Some lived quietly, and a few spoke about their motives with a mixture of regret and justification. For historians and for storytellers, the task is not to simplify Nakam into heroes or villains, but to place their acts in the layered context of trauma, institutional failure, and the contested ethics of retribution. If your viewers come away with one thought, let it be this: the moral and human wreckage of the Holocaust produced responses that were themselves morally complicated, sometimes horrific, and always revealing about the pressures that shape human behavior in the wake of mass crime.